March 4, 1913. Washington, D.C. William Howard Taft stood in the rain outside the Capitol, watching Woodrow Wilson take the oath of office as the 28th President of the United States. Taft's presidency was over. He had lost re-election in one of the most humiliating defeats in American history, finishing third in a race he had entered as the incumbent president. His best friend, Theodore Roosevelt, had betrayed him, running against him and splitting the Republican Party. Roosevelt called Taft a failure, a traitor, a man with the brains of a guinea pig. Their friendship, one of the deepest in American political history, was destroyed. Taft had spent 4 years in a job he never wanted, a job his wife pushed him into, a job that made him miserable every single day. He had been the most reluctant president in American history, and now he was the happiest ex-president. "I'm glad to be going," Taft said as he prepared to leave the White House. This is the loneliest place in the world. But William Howard Taft's story doesn't end with presidential failure. 8 years later, he would achieve his lifelong dream and become the only person in American history to serve as both president and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This is the story of William Howard Taft, a story of friendship and betrayal, of ambition and reluctance, of a man who became president to please everyone else and found happiness only when he finally pleased himself. This is not just the story of a failed president. This is the story of a man trapped in the wrong job, who lost everything he cared about, and then found redemption in the one position he always wanted. This is the story of William Howard Taft. Early life and the Cincinnati dynasty. William Howard Taft was born on September 15, 1857, in Cincinnati, Ohio, into one of the most prominent political families in the state. His father, Alphonso Taft, was a distinguished lawyer, judge, and diplomat who served as Secretary of War and Attorney General under President Ulysses S. Grant. His mother, Louise Torrey Taft, came from a wealthy Boston family and was a formidable woman who instilled in her children the highest expectations. William, called Willie as a child, was the second of 5 surviving children. From birth, he was groomed for greatness. The Taft family believed in public service, Republican politics, Yale education, and the law. Willie would follow that path exactly, but Willie was different from other ambitious political children. He was gentle, kind-hearted, and eager to please. He hated conflict and confrontation. He wanted everyone to like him, and he was big, very big. Even as a child, Willie was overweight. He was a large, soft boy who preferred reading and studying to sports and physical activity. He was self-conscious about his size, but his gentle nature and good humor made him popular with classmates. Willie excelled academically. He attended the Woodward High School in Cincinnati, where he was an outstanding student. In 1874, at age 16, Willie entered Yale College, following in his father's footsteps. At Yale, Taft was a successful, well-liked student. He joined the Skull and Bones Society, the most prestigious secret society at Yale. He was a talented wrestler. His size gave him a natural advantage, and he was active in campus politics and debate. Taft graduated from Yale in 1878, second in his class. His father was disappointed. He hadn't finished first. Willie returned to Cincinnati to study law at Cincinnati Law School, passing the Ohio bar in 1880 at age 23. Taft began practicing law in Cincinnati, but his real interest was in the judiciary. He didn't want to be a trial lawyer, arguing cases and confronting opponents. He wanted to be a judge, interpreting the law, writing careful opinions, working in quiet contemplation. In 1881, at just 24 years old, Taft was appointed assistant prosecutor of Hamilton County. In 1882, he was appointed collector of internal revenue for Ohio's 1st District. He was building a respectable legal and political career, but he still hadn't found his true calling. Then in 1886 came two events that would define his life. He met Nellie Herron, and he was appointed to a judgeship. Nellie and ambition Helen Nellie. Herron was the daughter of John Williamson Herron, a prominent Cincinnati lawyer and former law partner of President Rutherford B. Hayes. Nellie was intelligent, ambitious, cultured, and determined. She had visited the White House as a teenager and had dreamed ever since of becoming First Lady. Nellie met Will Taft at a sledding party in 1879. She was not immediately impressed. Taft was large, jovial, and seemed content with a quiet legal career. Nellie wanted more. She wanted power, prestige, and the White House. But Taft was smitten with Nellie. He courted her persistently for years. Nellie resisted, unsure if this good-natured lawyer had the drive and ambition she craved. Finally, in 1886, after a 7-year courtship, Nellie agreed to marry him, but with conditions. Nellie made it clear she would not be the wife of a provincial judge living quietly in Cincinnati. If Will wanted to marry her, he would have to pursue the highest offices in the land. She pushed him, challenged him, and directed his career with iron determination. On June 19, 1886, William Howard Taft and Helen Herron were married in Cincinnati. He was 28, she was 25. Their marriage would last 44 years and produce 3 children: Robert, born 1889, Helen, born 1891, and Charles, born 1897. Nellie loved Will, but she also saw him as her vehicle to the White House. She would push him toward the presidency even when he didn't want it. She would be the driving force behind his political rise, and ultimately, his unhappiness. Just 5 months before their marriage, in January 1886, Taft had been appointed to the Ohio Superior Court at age 29, one of the youngest judges in the state. He loved it. For the first time in his life, Taft felt he had found his calling. "I love judges and I love courts," Taft later wrote. "They are my ideals that typify on earth what we shall meet hereafter in heaven under a just God." Taft wanted to be a judge for the rest of his life. Nellie had other plans. The rising lawyer and judge from 1887 to 1890, Taft served on the Ohio Superior Court, writing careful, well-reasoned opinions and earning a reputation as a brilliant jurist. He was fair, thorough, and deeply committed to the law. But his judicial career was interrupted in 1890 when President Benjamin Harrison appointed Taft as Solicitor General of the United States, the government's chief lawyer before the Supreme Court. It was a prestigious position, and Taft moved his family to Washington, D.C. Taft argued 15 cases before the Supreme Court as Solicitor General, winning 8. He was competent, but he missed being a judge. Arguing cases didn't suit his temperament. He preferred thoughtful analysis to adversarial combat. In 1892, Taft's prayers were answered. President Harrison appointed him to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. At age 34, Taft became a federal appellate judge, a lifetime appointment that he could hold until death or retirement. Taft was ecstatic. He wrote elaborate, scholarly opinions. He was respected by lawyers, admired by colleagues, and happy. From 1892 to 1900, Taft served on the Sixth Circuit and also taught constitutional law at the Cincinnati Law School, later the University of Cincinnati College of Law. "I have the greatest contentment in my office," Taft wrote. This was where he belonged, not in politics, not in administration, but on the bench interpreting law. Nellie, however, was deeply dissatisfied. Judgeships didn't lead to the White House. She wanted Will in executive positions where he could build national recognition and political power. The conflict between what Taft wanted, the judiciary, and what Nellie wanted, political power, would define the rest of his life. And Taft, eager to please his wife and unable to say no to anyone, would consistently choose her ambitions over his own happiness. In 1900, President William McKinley offered Taft the position of President of the Philippine Commission, essentially the civilian governor of the newly acquired Philippines. It was an administrative position, not a judgeship. Taft didn't want it. He was happy on the bench, but Nellie wanted him to accept. She saw it as a stepping stone to higher office. McKinley and Secretary of War Elihu Root pressured him, emphasizing his duty to his country. Taft reluctantly accepted. He resigned his beloved judgeship and moved his family to the Philippines. It was the first time Taft chose political advancement over his judicial calling, and it set the pattern for the rest of his career. The Philippines and fame from 1900 to 1904, William Howard Taft served as the civil governor of the Philippines, overseeing the transition from military to civilian government following the Spanish-American War. The Philippines were in chaos. A brutal insurgency was being suppressed by American forces. Disease was rampant. Infrastructure was non-existent. The Filipino people were hostile to American occupation. Taft approached his task with genuine compassion and administrative skill. Unlike many American officials who viewed Filipinos as racial inferiors, Taft respected their dignity and capabilities. He called them "our little brown brothers," a phrase that was patronizing by modern standards but progressive for 1900. Taft built roads, schools, and hospitals. He established a civil service system based on merit, not patronage. He created a legal code and judicial system. He purchased land from the Catholic Church and redistributed it to Filipino farmers. He worked to prepare the Philippines for eventual self-government. Taft genuinely cared about the Filipino people, and they came to respect him. He was a large, jovial American who rode around Manila in a carriage, barely able to hold his weight, sweating profusely in the tropical heat, but working tirelessly to improve their lives. The tropical climate was brutal for Taft. At 6 feet tall and weighing over 300 pounds, he suffered terribly in the heat. He developed infections, dysentery, and other tropical diseases. His weight ballooned even higher as he ate to cope with stress. In 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt, who had become president after McKinley's assassination, offered Taft an appointment to the Supreme Court. It was Taft's dream job. Taft desperately wanted to accept, but he felt he couldn't leave the Philippines with his work unfinished. The Filipino people needed him. The islands weren't ready for the transition. Nellie also pushed him to refuse. The Supreme Court, she felt, would end his political career. How could you become president from the Supreme Court? Taft declined the appointment. It was one of the greatest regrets of his life. Roosevelt offered again in 1902. Again, Taft declined, citing unfinished work in the Philippines. In 1904, Roosevelt finally brought Taft home, but not to the Supreme Court. He appointed Taft as Secretary of War. Secretary of War and Roosevelt's protege from 1904 to 1908, William Howard Taft served as Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of War. But the title was misleading. Taft didn't run military operations. Instead, he became Roosevelt's most trusted advisor, troubleshooter, and political lieutenant. Roosevelt adored Taft. He called him the most lovable personality he had ever known. Roosevelt trusted Taft completely, sending him on diplomatic missions to the Philippines, Japan, Cuba, and Panama. When Roosevelt was away from Washington, Taft often acted as de facto president. Taft supervised the construction of the Panama Canal, negotiated with foreign governments, managed colonial possessions, and advised Roosevelt on virtually every major policy decision. The two men became extraordinarily close friends. They wrote to each other constantly, sometimes multiple times a day. Roosevelt valued Taft's intelligence, loyalty, and judgment. Taft admired Roosevelt's energy, vision, and leadership. Their families spent time together. Their children were friends. It was one of the deepest political friendships in American history, which made its eventual destruction all the more tragic. During these years, Taft's weight continued to increase. By 1908, he weighed approximately 340 pounds, making him by far the heaviest president in American history. Stories circulated about Taft getting stuck in the White House bathtub, some true, some exaggerated. A special oversized bathtub was eventually installed that could hold 4 normal-sized men. Taft's obesity was a source of constant public mockery and private shame. He tried repeatedly to lose weight through dieting and exercise, but always regained it. Food was his comfort in a life increasingly directed by others' ambitions rather than his own desires. In 1906, Chief Justice Melville Fuller was elderly and expected to retire soon. Taft hoped Roosevelt would nominate him to the Supreme Court. Instead, Roosevelt had other plans. Roosevelt had promised not to run for president again in 1908, but he wanted to ensure his progressive policies continued. He decided that William Howard Taft should be his successor. Taft didn't want to run for president. He wanted a seat on the Supreme Court, but Roosevelt insisted. Nellie insisted. Republican Party leaders insisted. Everyone told Taft it was his duty. Unable to say no, unable to disappoint the people he loved, William Howard Taft agreed to run for president, even though he knew in his heart it would make him miserable. The election of 1908, the 1908 presidential campaign pitted Republican William Howard Taft against Democrat William Jennings Bryan, who was running for president for the 3rd time. Theodore Roosevelt campaigned vigorously for Taft, calling him the most loyal friend and the man best qualified to continue Roosevelt's progressive agenda. Roosevelt's popularity and endorsement were crucial to Taft's campaign. Taft himself was an ineffective campaigner. He disliked giving speeches, hated attacking opponents, and found the entire process exhausting and undignified. He would rather be on the bench writing judicial opinions. But with Roosevelt's support and the strength of the Republican Party, Taft won easily, 321 electoral votes to Bryan's 162. Taft won 51.6% of the popular vote. On election night, Taft was subdued. He had just won the presidency of the United States, but he wasn't celebrating. Nellie, by contrast, was ecstatic. She had achieved her lifelong dream. She would be First Lady. "I am going to be president," Taft wrote privately, with resignation rather than joy. On March 4, 1909, William Howard Taft was inaugurated as the 27th President of the United States. A massive blizzard struck Washington that day, 16 inches of snow, the worst inaugural day weather since 1821. Taft took the oath of office indoors in the Senate chamber rather than outside at the Capitol. It was an ominous beginning. Theodore Roosevelt, meanwhile, left immediately after the inauguration for a year-long African safari. He wanted to give Taft space to establish his own presidency without Roosevelt overshadowing him. Roosevelt would come to regret that decision. The unhappy President William Howard Taft was miserable from the moment he became president. The job required everything he hated: confrontation, political maneuvering, public speaking, constant scrutiny, and decision-making under pressure. Taft was a judicial temperament in an executive office. He wanted to carefully analyze all sides of an issue, weigh precedents, and reach a measured decision. But the presidency required quick, decisive action. Taft agonized over every decision. "I am not fitted for the presidency," Taft confessed privately. "The president cannot be a judge. He has to decide instantly." Within 2 months of taking office, disaster struck the Taft household. On May 17, 1909, Nellie suffered a severe stroke that left her partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. She was just 47 years old. Nellie had been Taft's political partner, advisor, and driving force. Now she was incapacitated. Taft was devastated and had to manage the presidency without her guidance. Nellie would eventually recover much of her speech and mobility through intensive therapy, but she was never quite the same. The woman who had pushed Taft to the presidency couldn't fully enjoy it. Taft's presidency quickly ran into trouble. He had promised to continue Roosevelt's progressive policies, but conservative Republicans controlled Congress. Taft found himself trapped between progressive demands and conservative resistance. The Payne-Aldrich Tariff, 1909, Taft's first major crisis, involved tariff reform. Progressives wanted lower tariffs to reduce the cost of living for ordinary Americans. Taft supported tariff reduction. But conservative Republicans in Congress, led by Senator Nelson Aldrich, added hundreds of amendments that raised tariffs on many goods. The final bill, the Payne-Aldrich Tariff, barely reduced tariffs at all and actually increased some. Progressives were outraged and expected Taft to veto the bill. Instead, Taft signed it and then gave a speech calling it the best tariff bill the Republican Party ever passed. It was a political disaster. Progressives felt betrayed. Taft's reputation as a reformer was destroyed, and Roosevelt, watching from Africa, began to worry about his chosen successor. The Gifford-Pinchot controversy, 1909-1910, the second crisis involved conservation. Roosevelt had protected millions of acres of public land with the help of his chief forester, Gifford Pinchot, one of Roosevelt's closest friends. Taft's Interior Secretary, Richard Ballinger, was more sympathetic to business interests and opened some protected lands to private development. Pinchot publicly accused Ballinger of betraying conservation and corruption. Taft faced a terrible choice: support Pinchot and anger his own cabinet, or support Ballinger and anger conservationists and Roosevelt. Taft, after carefully reviewing the evidence in a judicial manner, concluded that Pinchot was insubordinate and that Ballinger had done nothing illegal. In January 1910, Taft fired Gifford Pinchot. Progressives exploded in fury. Roosevelt, who loved Pinchot like a brother, was deeply hurt. Taft had fired Roosevelt's closest ally. The relationship between Taft and Roosevelt began to fracture. Congressional defeats. Throughout 1910, Taft fought with the progressive wing of his own party. Progressive Republicans, led by Senator Robert La Follette, attacked Taft for betraying Roosevelt's legacy. In the 1910 midterm elections, Democrats won control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 16 years. It was a humiliating defeat for Taft and the Republicans. Taft was exhausted, depressed, and isolated. He had no political instincts, no ability to build coalitions, and no talent for public relations. He was a judge trying to do a politician's job. I have come to the conclusion that the major part of the work of a president is to increase the gate receipts of expositions and fairs and bring tourists to town, Taft wrote bitterly. He took comfort in food. His weight approached 350 pounds. He fell asleep in meetings, at public events, even during important conversations. People joked that Taft's favorite exercise was nodding off, but the worst was yet to come. Theodore Roosevelt was coming home. The break with Roosevelt, when Theodore Roosevelt returned from Africa in June 1910, he found American politics transformed. Progressives were in open rebellion against Taft. Conservatives controlled the Republican Party, and everyone told Roosevelt that Taft had betrayed everything Roosevelt stood for. Roosevelt tried to stay neutral. He met with Taft in June 1910, and the meeting was cordial but tense. Publicly, Roosevelt supported Taft. Privately, he was disappointed. Over the following year, the Roosevelt-Taft friendship disintegrated. Roosevelt became increasingly critical of Taft's conservatism. Taft felt betrayed by Roosevelt's disloyalty and wounded by his criticism. The breaking point came in late 1911. Progressive Republicans begged Roosevelt to challenge Taft for the 1912 Republican nomination. Roosevelt initially refused, but the pressure was overwhelming. On February 21, 1912, Theodore Roosevelt announced he would seek the Republican nomination, directly challenging his hand-picked successor and former best friend. Taft was devastated. He wept when he heard the news. "Roosevelt was my closest friend," Taft said, his voice breaking. But Taft also decided to fight back. For the first time in his presidency, Taft showed real passion, not for policy, but to defend himself against Roosevelt's attacks. The 1912 Republican primary campaign was vicious. Roosevelt won most of the primaries, 9 out of 12 states that held them. He had more popular support than Taft, but Taft controlled the party machinery. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago in June 1912, party bosses awarded disputed delegates to Taft, giving him the nomination. Roosevelt's supporters claimed the nomination was stolen. They accused Taft of corruption and fraud. Roosevelt called Taft a puzzlewit with the brains of a guinea pig. Taft responded with uncharacteristic bitterness, calling Roosevelt a dangerous egotist and neurotic. Their friendship was destroyed. They would not speak to each other for 8 years. Roosevelt's supporters walked out of the Republican convention and formed the Progressive Bull Moose Party, nominating Roosevelt as their candidate. The 1912 election became a three-way race: Republican Taft, Progressive Roosevelt, and Democrat Woodrow Wilson. The election of 1912 humiliation, the 1912 presidential campaign, was one of the most dramatic in American history, and the most humiliating for William Howard Taft. Taft knew he couldn't win. Roosevelt and Taft would split the Republican vote, virtually guaranteeing a Democratic victory. But Taft stayed in the race, determined to prevent Roosevelt from winning and proving that Roosevelt had betrayed the Republican Party. Taft barely campaigned. He gave some speeches, but spent much of the campaign in the White House, depressed and resigned to defeat. Roosevelt campaigned with his usual manic energy, giving speeches across the country and attacking both Taft and Wilson. On October 14, 1912, Roosevelt was shot in the chest in Milwaukee and famously gave a 90-minute speech with a bullet lodged near his lung. Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate and former president of Princeton University, ran a thoughtful, progressive campaign promising new freedom, reforms. On November 5, 1912, the results were devastating for Taft. Woodrow Wilson, Democrat, 435 electoral votes, 41.8% popular vote. Theodore Roosevelt, Progressive, 88 electoral votes, 27.4% popular vote. William Howard Taft, Republican, 8 electoral votes, 23.2% popular vote. Taft won only 2 states, Utah and Vermont. He finished third in a race he entered as the sitting president. It was the worst defeat for an incumbent president in American history. Roosevelt had split the Republican Party and destroyed Taft's presidency. But Roosevelt also failed to win, and his Progressive Party would soon collapse. Both men had lost everything in their war against each other. Taft was relieved. "I am glad to be going," he said. "This is the loneliest place in the world." On March 4, 1913, Taft attended Wilson's inauguration, then left Washington immediately. He was 55 years old, politically finished, humiliated, and exhausted. But William Howard Taft's story was not over. His greatest achievement was still ahead. Redemption Chief Justice, after leaving the presidency, Taft returned to Cincinnati and accepted a position as Kent Professor of Constitutional Law at Yale Law School. He loved it. Teaching constitutional law, writing scholarly articles, and working with students was exactly what Taft had always wanted. He also gave lectures, served on corporate boards, and wrote extensively on legal and political topics. For the first time in years, Taft was happy. In 1918, Theodore Roosevelt died at age 60. Taft had not spoken to him in 8 years. When Taft heard the news, he wept. "I loved him always and cherish his memory," Taft wrote. In 1921, Chief Justice Edward Douglas White died. President Warren G. Harding, a Republican who admired Taft, offered Taft the position he had wanted his entire life, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Taft was 63 years old. His dream had finally come true. On June 30, 1921, the Senate confirmed Taft as Chief Justice by a unanimous vote. William Howard Taft became the only person in American history to serve as both President and Chief Justice. Taft served as Chief Justice for 9 years, from 1921 to 1930. He was brilliant, energetic, and happy. He wrote 253 opinions and transformed the administrative operations of the federal judiciary. Taft's most important achievement was convincing Congress to pass the Judiciary Act of 1925, which gave the Supreme Court greater control over its docket and made the court more efficient. Taft also oversaw the construction of the Supreme Court building, the beautiful neoclassical structure that houses the court today. Previously, the Supreme Court had met in the Capitol building. Taft ensured the court would have its own marble palace. "I don't remember that I ever was president," Taft joked happily during his years as Chief Justice, but Taft's health was failing. His weight, which had dropped somewhat after leaving the presidency, caused heart problems, high blood pressure, and difficulty breathing. In 1930, at age 72, Taft's health collapsed. On February 3, 1930, Taft resigned as Chief Justice, the first and only Chief Justice to retire rather than die in office. William Howard Taft died on March 8, 1930, at age 72 in Washington, D.C. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, the first president buried there. His wife Nellie, who survived him by 13 years, was buried beside him in 1943. Legacy. William Howard Taft's legacy is that of a man trapped in the wrong job who found redemption by finally doing what he loved. As president, Taft was a failure. He lacked the political skills, the temperament, and the desire to be an effective chief executive. He broke with Theodore Roosevelt, split the Republican Party, and suffered one of the worst electoral defeats in American history. But Taft's presidency wasn't entirely unsuccessful. He brought 90 antitrust lawsuits, more than Roosevelt, earning him the title of the true trust buster. He established the federal income tax through the 16th Amendment, ratified 1913. He created the Children's Bureau to protect child welfare. He expanded civil service protections and professionalized the federal workforce. He supported the 17th Amendment. Providing for direct election of senators, ratified 1913. Taft was a progressive reformer, but he lacked Roosevelt's charisma and political genius. He couldn't sell his achievements or build coalitions. He was a competent administrator lost in a politician's world. As Chief Justice, however, Taft was magnificent. He modernized the federal judiciary, wrote important constitutional opinions, and built the Supreme Court into the powerful institution it is today. Taft's life teaches an important lesson. Success isn't just about achieving high office. It's about finding the work that matches your talents and temperament. Taft spent 4 miserable years as president because he couldn't say no to the people he loved. He spent 9 happy years as Chief Justice doing the work he was born to do. In my present life, "I don't remember that I ever was president," Taft said contentedly on the court. William Howard Taft was the 300-pound president who got stuck in bathtubs, the reluctant politician who hated politics, the loyal friend betrayed by Theodore Roosevelt, the failed president who became a great Chief Justice. He proved that sometimes the greatest success comes not from reaching the highest office, but from finally finding the right one. This is the legacy of William Howard Taft, the man who became president to please everyone else and found happiness only when he finally pleased himself. This is the story of William Howard Taft,